Out here, in the cold abyss of space, there are no second chances. No one comes to save you. No one hears you scream. But sometimes, just sometimes, fate decides otherwise. Nathan Hale never believed in destiny. He believed in choices, in survival. Yet when his burning ship crashed onto the frozen wasteland of Glacius 9, he had no idea that this would be the beginning of something far greater than just staying alive. A rogue soldier. A woman with golden eyes hiding a deadly secret. A love forged in fire, betrayal, and war. Welcome to Alien Love Chronicles, where love is not just a feeling, but a battle. A story of passion, trust, and the fight for freedom across the stars. Stay until the end. You won't believe where this journey takes them. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support fuels the next great adventure. Nathan Hale knew he was going to die. The realization hit him somewhere between the moment his ship took a direct hit and the moment he lost control of the thrusters, watching helplessly as the planet below loomed closer. The cockpit was a nightmare of flashing red lights and blaring alarms, warning of imminent impact, not that he needed a reminder. Through the cracked visor of his helmet, he caught a glimpse of the vast, icy wasteland stretching endlessly beneath him. Glacius 9, a frozen, uninhabitable rock at the edge of known space. The kind of place no one would look for survivors. Nathan clenched his teeth, hands gripping the controls as he fought against gravity. But the ship was dead weight now. Nothing but a burning metal coffin spiraling toward oblivion. A violent tremor rocked the hull, and the left wing snapped off with a deafening shriek of tearing steel. His stomach lurched as the ship pitched sideways, spinning wildly. A rush of heat and smoke filled the cockpit as a small explosion burst from the back panel, sending sparks flying. Nathan barely had time to brace before impact. The world slammed into him like a hammer. A sickening crunch reverberated through his bones as the ship plowed into the ice, tearing a jagged scar across the frozen landscape. The force wrenched him forward against the restraints, pain exploding through his chest. The glass canopy cracked, spiderwebbing across the surface before shattering entirely. The wind roared in, an unforgiving wall of cold that cut through his flight suit like knives. The impact had knocked the breath from his lungs, leaving him gasping against the icy air. For a long moment, he just lay there. Everything was silent except for the faint crackling of burning wires and the howling wind outside. His vision swam, blurring in and out of focus as his body screamed in protest. Pain. Sharp. Deep. His ribs. Definitely cracked. Maybe worse. Nathan sucked in a breath, wincing. The metallic taste of blood coated his tongue. Not dead. Not yet. He forced himself to move, his fingers stiff and sluggish as he reached for the release latch on his harness. It jammed at first, frozen in place, but after a few desperate tugs, it gave way. He collapsed forward, catching himself against the console before he could crumple completely. His left leg throbbed, sprained at best, fractured at worst. His entire body felt like it had been put through a grinder. But he was alive. The ship, on the other hand, was done for. Nathan turned his head, blinking past the haze in his vision. What was left of the fuselage was embedded in a shallow ravine, half buried in snow and ice. Smoke billowed from the exposed engines, flickering with the last dying embers of fire. The hull groaned under its own weight, twisted metal barely holding together. It wouldn't last, and neither would he if he stayed. Gritting his teeth, Nathan reached for the emergency hatch lever and yanked it down. The mechanism sputtered, then hissed as the door partially disengaged, jammed at an awkward angle. He muttered a curse under his breath and shoved at it with his shoulder. It didn't budge. Panic tightened in his throat. He wasn't dying here. With a grunt of effort, he braced his good leg against the console and kicked. The force jarred through his injured ribs, but the hatch finally gave way, swinging outward with a screech of metal. A blast of freezing air slammed into him, sharp enough to steal what little breath he had left. Nathan grimaced, pulling himself through the opening and out into the storm. The cold hit him like a physical force, seeping instantly through his gear. The wind was relentless, carrying fine shards of ice that cut against his exposed skin like razors. Snow churned in a chaotic frenzy, thick enough to obscure the horizon. He had minutes, maybe less, before hypothermia set in. Nathan turned, scanning the barren landscape. Endless ice, no shelter, no cover, nothing. His stomach twisted. This planet was going to kill him. Then, movement. Not an animal, not a structure, just a flicker, a light. Faint, barely visible through the blizzard, but unmistakably real. Nathan exhaled, his breath misting instantly in the air. It could be anything, a reflection off the ice, a fire from another wreck, or it could be his only shot at survival. Either way, standing here debating wasn't an option. He took a step. His injured leg nearly buckled, but he forced himself forward. One step, then another. The wind screamed around him, drowning out his thoughts. Each breath was a battle, each movement a war against the cold gnawing at his bones. The light pulsed in the distance, steady and unwavering. A beacon. It could be salvation. Or it could be a trap. He didn't care. Right now, it was the only thing keeping him moving. Nathan clenched his jaw, ignoring the burn in his lungs, the searing pain in his ribs. He had survived worse. The thought kept him going, step by step, mile by mile. The snow swallowed his footprints as fast as he made them, erasing any sign that he had ever been there. The light grew closer, still distant, still unreachable. His vision blurred. His limbs felt like lead. Just a little farther, a little more. He stumbled, knees hitting ice. The cold bit into him, but he forced himself up, cursing under his breath. He wasn't dying here. Not like this. The light wavered again. Closer now. Warmer. Nathan gritted his teeth and pushed forward. One more step. One more breath. Then, darkness. The last thing he saw before collapsing was the glow of the cabin's firelight, flickering behind the frost-covered window. The wooden door creaked open just enough to allow a sliver of golden light to spill into the storm. Warmth radiated from within, a stark contrast to the frozen wasteland outside. Yet the threshold was anything but inviting. The figure standing in the doorway was still, watching, her presence sharper than the icy wind that howled through the cracks in the cabin's structure. Nathan barely registered the shift in temperature before his gaze locked onto hers. Golden eyes, cold, unblinking, and utterly unreadable, assessed him in an instant. Her face, partially obscured by the shadows, revealed smooth, sharp features, framed by strands of silver hair that shimmered like frost beneath the firelight. There was no flicker of surprise, no softening of expression, only a quiet calculation that sent a warning through Nathan's already battered body. His instinct screamed danger. Her hand, poised with deliberate precision, rested on the hilt of a blade strapped to her hip. It wasn't an idle gesture. She was waiting. Waiting for an excuse, a misstep, a single wrong move that would give her reason to act. Nathan swallowed hard against the dryness in his throat. The blizzard raged behind him, consuming the world in a violent swirl of white, erasing his footprints as though he had never existed. He had two choices. Stand here and freeze or step forward and risk whatever fate awaited him inside. The woman's gaze narrowed. A human? Her voice was barely more than a whisper, but it cut through the wind with precision, edged with something sharp and wary. Nathan exhaled, breath misting in the cold. His limbs were shaking, exhaustion dragging him toward the brink of collapse, but he forced himself to remain standing, to hold her gaze as if he weren't moments from passing out. "Yeah," he rasped, the word coming out rough, scraping against the rawness in his throat. For a long, tense second, neither of them moved. The fire behind her flickered, casting long shadows across the walls, highlighting the sparse interior of the cabin. It was small. Too small for unnecessary luxuries, built for survival rather than comfort. Nathan barely had time to register these details before she moved. Fast. A blur of silver and steel. The cold kiss of a blade pressed against his throat. He stiffened, pulse hammering against the metal. She was close now. So close he could see the faint rise and fall of her breath. The way her expression remained eerily unreadable despite the blade she held against him. She could kill him right now. No hesitation, no effort. He forced himself to stay still. "All right," he muttered, voice strained but steady. "If you're going to kill me, at least let me sit down first." A flicker, so brief it could have been imagined, crossed her golden eyes. A pause in the tension, as if she hadn't expected the response. Nathan took it as a small victory. She didn't press harder, but she didn't pull away either. He was painfully aware of how weak he looked, how vulnerable. His flight suit was torn, streaked with dried blood. His left leg barely held him upright. He knew she saw all of it, analyzing, calculating. And yet, she hadn't struck. Not yet. Seconds stretched. The storm raged louder. Then finally, she exhaled sharply. The blade lowered. Not completely, but enough that Nathan could breathe again. "Inside," she said, voice cold but controlled. He hesitated, not out of distrust, but because standing any longer was becoming an impossibility. When he took a step forward, his knees buckled beneath him. He barely registered the sensation of falling before he hit the wooden floor, his body too numb to brace for impact. Warmth. Not immediate, not consuming, but it was there. The fire crackled somewhere nearby, its glow pressing against the darkness that had been clawing at the edges of his vision. The scent of burning wood mixed with something else, something metallic, sterile. Footsteps. He forced his eyes open. She stood over him, arms crossed, gaze unreadable. Not concerned, not relieved, just watching. Nathan swallowed hard and dragged himself upright, ignoring the way his body screamed in protest. The woman didn't move to help him, but she didn't stop him either. Finally, she spoke. "You're injured." Nathan let out a dry, humorless laugh. "No kidding." Her eyes flicked over him again, noting the bruises, the torn flight suit, the gash along his temple that had stopped bleeding but still pulsed with dull pain. For a moment, it looked as if she might say something else. Then she turned, moving toward a small storage chest against the far wall. Nathan didn't miss the way she moved. Efficient, controlled. Not just a survivor, but something more. A soldier, maybe. Or something worse. She rummaged through the supplies, eventually tossing a bundle of dark fabric onto the floor beside him. "Put that on," she said. "Your suit is useless." Nathan looked at the clothing. Thick, insulated layers, clearly made for surviving in this frozen wasteland. He glanced back up at her. Generous. She gave him a look that made it clear she wasn't doing this out of kindness. "It's not generosity," she said flatly. "It's survival. If you die here, you become my problem." Nathan studied her for a long moment. She didn't trust him. That much was obvious. But she had let him in. She had given him warmth, shelter, clothing. He had met enough people in his life to know that someone willing to help, no matter how begrudgingly, was a rare thing. Slowly, he reached for the clothes. His hands were stiff, fingers half numb, but he managed. As he pulled the thick material over his battered body, he felt the first hints of warmth sinking into his frozen skin. He let out a slow breath. For the first time since crashing onto this godforsaken planet, he wasn't actively dying. It wasn't much, but it was enough. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, less sharp. "Got a name?" She hesitated. Then, finally, "Elara." Nathan nodded, filing the name away. Whatever storm he had just walked into, he knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The fire crackled softly in the small cabin, its warmth doing little to thaw the tension between them. Nathan sat at the wooden table, fingers wrapped around a metal cup filled with something hot and bitter. His body still ached from the crash, his ribs protesting every deep breath. But at least he could feel his fingers again. That was progress. Across from him, Elara moved with quiet efficiency, her back to him as she sorted through supplies in a makeshift storage chest. She hadn't spoken much since letting him in, just enough to give orders, just enough to make it clear that she wasn't particularly thrilled about his presence. Nathan wasn't a fool. He knew she was debating whether or not she had made a mistake by letting him live. "So," he said finally, his voice rough from exhaustion, "not exactly the warmest welcome I've ever had." Elara didn't turn. "You're alive, aren't you?" "Barely." She pulled out a bundle of dried rations, tossing one onto the table without looking at him. "Eat." Nathan eyed the package, unimpressed. "You always this charming?" Elara turned then, fixing him with a look that could have frozen the fire itself. "Do you always talk this much?" He smirked. "Only when I'm trying to annoy someone." "Then congratulations, you're succeeding." Nathan huffed a quiet laugh but didn't push further. She wasn't the kind for small talk. That much was obvious. He opened the ration pack and took a bite. It was about as appetizing as cardboard, but at least it was food. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind outside and the occasional pop of the fire. The silence was suffocating. Not because of the lack of words, but because of the unspoken weight pressing between them. Nathan studied her as he ate. She moved with the kind of controlled precision he had seen in elite soldiers, the ones who had spent their entire lives trained for war. There was no hesitation in her actions, no wasted movement. She wasn't just some survivor eking out an existence on an ice rock. She was something else entirely. A fighter, a killer. He had seen enough of them to recognize one. "So," he said, voice deceptively light. "What's your story?" Elara didn't pause in her movements. "I don't have one." "Right," he drawled. "Because everyone just happens to end up living alone in a frozen wasteland." She set a metal tin down a little too forcefully. "You ask a lot of questions." "It's a habit." Nathan leaned back slightly in his chair, watching her with open curiosity. "You don't look like a hermit." Elara finally turned to face him fully. The golden hue of her eyes gleamed in the dim light, unreadable but sharp. "And you don't look like someone who should still be breathing." Nathan grinned. "Must be my winning personality." Elara exhaled through her nose, clearly unimpressed. "Eat your food and rest. You won't last long out here if you don't recover." Nathan took another bite, but didn't look away. She was hiding something. She had been on edge since the moment she opened that door, not just because of him, but because of something else. Something deeper. "I get the feeling you're not used to guests." Elara turned back to the storage chest, pulling out a fresh set of bandages. "I don't have guests." "Figures," Nathan muttered. "You don't seem the hospitable type." She stilled for just a fraction of a second. A pause so brief he almost missed it. Almost. Nathan didn't believe in coincidences, and he definitely didn't believe she was just some exile hiding from the cold. "You were in the military, weren't you?" Elara stiffened, fingers tightening around the bandages before she slowly placed them down. "That's none of your concern." "That's a yes." Elara's jaw clenched, and for the first time, there was something more in her expression than just detached indifference, irritation. Nathan shrugged. "It's not exactly hard to tell. You move like a soldier, you think like one. Even the way you watch me, you're constantly assessing, deciding if I'm a threat." He leaned forward slightly, meeting her gaze head-on. "So, what are you? A deserter? A war criminal?" Her eyes flashed dangerously. "Careful, human." Nathan held up his hands in mock surrender. "Just making conversation." "You should stop." He considered her for a moment before shaking his head. "Yeah. See? That's the problem. You let me in, but you don't trust me, which means I'm either your prisoner or a liability, and I'm really hoping it's not the first one." Elara didn't respond. She didn't have to. The weight of unspoken words lingered between them. Nathan sighed, leaning back again. "You know, I don't care why you're out here. I really don't. But I'd like to know if I'm sharing a roof with someone who might slit my throat in my sleep." Elara turned away sharply, her hands pressing against the edge of the table. For the first time, she looked almost unsettled. "I don't kill without reason," she said finally. Nathan let out a breath. "Good to know." Silence stretched between them again, heavier this time. Then, suddenly, Elara stiffened. Her fingers twitched slightly, her breathing hitching for just a fraction of a second. Then her entire body went rigid. Nathan tensed. "What is it?" Elara's hands clenched into fists at her sides. It was happening again. A rush of images. Thoughts that weren't hers. Sensations bleeding into her mind like ink spreading through water. Nathan. His thoughts, unfiltered, unguarded, slipping into her consciousness before she could stop them. Flashes of memory. The cockpit shuddering as he fought to regain control. Pain exploding through his ribs. The certainty of death. The desperation. The crushing weight of knowing no one was coming for him. And beneath it all, a deep, aching loneliness buried under layers of sarcasm and deflection. Elara gasped, stumbling back as if she had been physically struck. Nathan shot to his feet. "What the hell just happened?" She gritted her teeth, pressing her fingers to her temple, forcing the intruding thoughts back. The violation, unintentional, but no less disturbing, made her stomach twist. "I don't know," she snapped, voice tight. Nathan took a cautious step forward. "You just—" He hesitated, eyes narrowing. "You were in my head." Elara's breath came quick, shallow. The room suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in. She hadn't meant to. It was getting worse. "I said I don't know," she bit out. Nathan studied her, his usual smirk nowhere in sight. Then, after a long moment, he exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Okay. Well, if you ever do that again, at least warn me first." Elara shot him a glare, but he only grinned. Whatever had just happened, she knew one thing for certain. This man was going to be a problem. The storm had quieted, but the tension inside the cabin had not. The fire flickered low, casting restless shadows across the rough wooden walls. Nathan sat at the edge of the table, idly rotating the handle of his knife between his fingers, his mind still replaying the moment Elara had accidentally breached his thoughts the night before. She hadn't spoken about it since, and neither had he. But something had shifted between them. He could feel it. Elara, standing by the window, was unnervingly still, her golden eyes locked on the swirling snow outside. She wasn't just watching, she was listening. Nathan knew that look. The kind soldiers wore before a fight. Then he heard it. A sound carried by the wind, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps. Not his. Not hers. Someone else was out there. Nathan set the knife down slowly. "Expecting company?" Elara didn't answer. Her fingers curled around the hilt of her blade, and that was answer enough. Then the knock came. Slow. Deliberate. Too measured for someone simply seeking shelter. Nathan exchanged a glance with Elara. She moved first, stepping toward the door without hesitation. He followed, keeping a hand near the gun he'd found in her supplies earlier. He hadn't asked if he was allowed to take it, and she hadn't told him to put it back. Elara unlatched the door and pulled it open just enough to see who stood on the other side. A tall figure loomed in the entrance, cloaked in black, his broad shoulders dusted with snow. His smirk was slow, deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. Nathan didn't like him immediately. "Hello, Elara," the man drawled, voice smooth like oil over steel. "It's been a while." Elara didn't react, but Nathan felt the shift in her posture, the slight tightening of her grip on the door. "Darek," she said, her voice as cold as the wind outside. "Darek Rowe." Nathan had never heard the name before, but something in Elara's tone made it clear. Whoever this man was, he wasn't a stranger. Darek's smirk widened. "Still hiding in the cold, I see. Not your usual style." Nathan stepped closer. "You want something, or are you just here for the small talk?" Darek's gaze flicked to him, as if noticing him for the first time. He studied Nathan, then chuckled. "A human? That's new. Didn't take you for the sentimental type, Elara." Nathan bristled. He had met men like Darek before, men who walked into a room like they owned it, who weighed every conversation like it was a game they were already winning. He hated men like that. Elara didn't move. "State your business, Rowe." Darek sighed, exaggerated. like this whole thing was exhausting for him. All right, let's skip the pleasantries. I'm here because there's a price on your head big enough to fund an entire fleet. And before you think of running, know that I didn't come alone. Nathan tensed. He hadn't seen anyone else outside, but that didn't mean they weren't there. Elara's jaw tightened. Who sent you? Darek tilted his head. Come on, don't play dumb. You know exactly who wants you back. The only question is, are you coming quietly, or are we going to do this the hard way? Nathan had heard enough. His hand closed around the grip of his gun. She's not going anywhere. Darek sighed, shaking his head. You really have no idea who you're protecting, do you? Nathan didn't move. Darek's smirk returned, but this time there was something sharper beneath it. She didn't tell you, did she? He turned back to Elara. Should I do the honors, or would you like to tell your new friend why you're worth more than an entire warship? Elara's silence was answer enough. Darek took that as permission to continue. She's carrying information that could bring down the entire Talisar Empire. Classified documents, war crimes, proof of their little experiments. His gaze flicked to Nathan. You like breathing, human? Because the people looking for her will burn down planets to make sure those secrets die with her. Nathan didn't let his expression change, but something inside him shifted. Elara had been keeping something from him. Something bigger than just survival. Elara stepped forward, voice low and lethal. You don't know what you're talking about, Ro. Darek laughed. Oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about, and so do the soldiers tracking you as we speak. The tension snapped. Elara moved first. A flash of silver as she lunged, her blade aimed for Darek's throat. He dodged, barely, stepping back as his own weapon came free from his belt. Nathan barely had time to react before the first shot rang out. He ducked, rolling toward the side of the cabin as a second figure emerged from the darkness outside, rifle raised. A sniper. Nathan didn't think. He acted. He grabbed the overturned chair beside him and hurled it toward the window. The impact shattered the glass, sending shards flying. The sniper flinched, momentarily blinded. It was enough. Nathan dove forward, slamming the butt of his gun into the sniper's ribs. The man stumbled, and Nathan followed up with a sharp, calculated kick that sent him crashing to the ground. Elara and Darek were locked in their own fight. The room was a blur of movement. Two fighters who had done this before, each anticipating the other's strikes. Darek was fast. Elara was faster. Her blade caught the edge of his coat, slicing through the fabric just as he twisted away. He grinned, eyes gleaming with something like amusement. Still sharp, he murmured. Elara didn't reply. She just drove forward again, this time forcing him back toward the door. Nathan barely registered the next gunshot before the entire cabin shuddered. A warning shot. Outside, more figures emerged from the storm. More than two. More than three. Nathan swore under his breath. Darek sighed, stepping back toward the threshold. I'd love to stay and catch up, but I have orders. And since you don't seem inclined to cooperate, I'll just leave you with a friendly reminder. Elara didn't lower her blade. Darek's smirk never wavered. You can run, Elara, but you know how this ends. With that, he turned, disappearing into the snow. Nathan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Elara stood motionless for a moment, then slowly exhaled. When she turned to face him, her expression was unreadable. Nathan holstered his gun. So, he said, voice casual despite the lingering adrenaline. You want to tell me what the hell that was about? Elara looked at him, something flickering in her golden eyes. Not yet, she said. Nathan's jaw tightened, but he didn't push. He had a feeling he was going to regret this. Nathan Hale had betrayed her. The thought weighed on him like lead, pressing against his ribs as he stared at the blinking light on the comm panel. The message had already been sent. The coordinates. The confirmation. Everything the Empire needed to take her. And in return, a ticket home. That had been the deal. Deliver Elara Voss, the fugitive carrying secrets that could bring the Empire to its knees, and he'd be granted safe passage back to Earth. Simple. Except it wasn't. Outside, the wind howled across the frozen wasteland, a relentless force of nature. Inside, in the dim firelight of the cabin, Elara moved in silence, sharpening her blade. She didn't know what he had done. Not yet. Nathan shifted in his seat, his fingers twitching against his knee. He told himself this was the right choice, that he had no loyalty to her, that she was dangerous. So why did it feel like he was the one walking toward a death sentence? A sharp knock echoed through the cabin. Elara's head snapped up. Nathan barely had time to stand before the door was kicked open. A gust of snow rushed inside as soldiers stormed through the threshold, their rifles raised. Their movements were efficient, trained, no hesitation. Elara was already in motion, her blade flashing. The first soldier barely had time to react before she struck, slashing across his chest. Blood sprayed the wooden floor. The second fired his weapon, a stun round. It hit her square in the ribs. Her body convulsed, the impact driving her to her knees. Her breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, but she didn't scream. Nathan didn't move. He stood frozen as they grabbed her, twisting her arms behind her back, forcing her down. Elara turned her head just enough to look at him. The betrayal was already in her eyes. She didn't need to ask. She knew. Nathan clenched his jaw, his fists curling at his sides. They dragged her outside, the storm swallowing her whole. He followed in silence, each step feeling heavier than the last. The unmarked transport ship loomed ahead, waiting like an open grave. One of the officers clapped a gloved hand on Nathan's shoulder. "Good work, Hale." Nathan didn't respond. The officer gestured toward the ramp. "Come on, you'll be home before sunrise." Nathan hesitated, his breath misted in the cold air. Elara had stopped struggling. She wasn't begging, wasn't fighting. She had already lost. And yet... Nathan's stomach twisted. He stepped onto the ship, and the doors sealed behind them with a final, resounding hiss. The journey was silent. Nathan didn't go to the command deck. He didn't watch the coordinates shift as they left Glacius 9 behind. Instead, he found himself walking toward the detention block. He wasn't sure why. He already knew what he would find. Through the reinforced glass of the cell, Elara knelt on the floor, her wrists bound, her silver hair streaked with blood. The suppression collar around her neck hummed faintly, designed to keep her abilities locked away. She lifted her head. Her golden eyes met his through the glass. Nathan's chest tightened. She didn't look at him with anger, just quiet disappointment. He exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. Footsteps approached. A soldier stopped beside him, smirking. "She's tough. Hasn't said a word." Nathan didn't respond. The soldier chuckled. "Doesn't matter. Command wants her broken before we reach the capital." He tilted his head. "You want to watch?" Nathan moved before he could think. One clean strike. His fist slammed into the man's throat, cutting off any sound before he could cry out. The soldier staggered. Nathan didn't stop. He grabbed the man by the collar and drove his head into the wall. The body hit the floor with a dull thud. Nathan exhaled. No turning back now. He swiped the access card from the unconscious soldier's belt and pressed it against the panel. The cell door slid open. Elara didn't move. She just watched him, waiting. Nathan hesitated. Then, he dropped to his knees beside her and reached for the restraints. They clicked open. The collar followed. Still she didn't move. Finally she spoke. "Why?" Nathan swallowed. He could have said it was a mistake, that he hadn't thought it through, that he had been wrong. Instead, he just told her the truth. "Because I couldn't let them have you." Elara stared at him for a long moment. Something unreadable flickered in her gaze, but there was no time. The alarms started blaring. Nathan grabbed the fallen soldier's gun and held it out to her. Elara took it without hesitation. Footsteps echoed down the hall. They were coming. Nathan's grip tightened on his weapon. Elara shifted beside him, her voice calm despite the chaos. "We need to move." Nathan nodded once. Together, they ran. The air inside the Imperial Command outpost was thick with smoke and the acrid scent of burning metal. Warning sirens blared, their shrill cries echoing through the crumbling walls as chaos erupted. Soldiers rushed through the corridors, weapons drawn, orders being shouted over the comms, but it was already too late. The battle had begun. Elara stood in the center of it, her back pressed against a rusted console, golden eyes scanning the battlefield through the shattered remains of a viewing window. Beyond the reinforced glass, the sky was a storm of fire and debris. The Imperial fleet hovered like vultures over the wreckage of their own crumbling base, the dark banners of the Empire snapping violently in the wind. And at the heart of it all, Orin Stroud stood tall, unwavering, the glint of his officer's insignia barely dulled by the blood splattered across his uniform. He had won. Or at least, he thought he had. Nathan was already on the floor, breathing but barely conscious, his gun knocked far from reach. Elara had spent every last ounce of energy fighting, dodging, killing to get here. And yet, Stroud remained untouched, watching her with that same calm, measured look. The look of a man who knew the game had already been decided. "You put up a good fight," Stroud said, stepping forward, boots crunching over broken glass. "But it ends here." Elara said nothing. She just steadied her breath, fingers twitching toward the knife hidden beneath her belt. Stroud tilted his head slightly. "I don't know why you ran, Voss. You had a place in the Empire. You had a purpose." His voice was almost curious, like he was trying to solve a puzzle that refused to fit together. "Did you really think you could win against us?" Elara lifted her chin, meeting his gaze head-on. "I never wanted to win. I wanted to be free." Stroud sighed, shaking his head. "A shame." The moment his fingers twitched toward his weapon, she moved. Fast. She lunged, her blade flashing toward his throat. Stroud blocked it easily, his own knife twisting in a deadly arc as he countered. The two clashed violently, a blur of steel and instinct. Elara struck low. Stroud dodged. He retaliated. She deflected. Then, suddenly, Stroud shifted, angling his body slightly, and Elara barely caught the subtle glance he shot over her shoulder. Too late. A gunshot rang out. White-hot pain exploded through her side as the impact threw her backward. She hit the ground hard, gasping as blood soaked through the fabric of her jacket. The shot hadn't killed her, but it had been close. Stroud's lieutenant stood a few feet away, guns still raised, his smirk sharp as a blade. Elara's vision blurred. She tried to move, but her limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. Stroud stepped closer, crouching beside her. "This is where it ends," he murmured, voice almost pitying. "You should have come back when you had the chance." Elara braced herself. Then, a second shot echoed, but it wasn't aimed at her. The lieutenant staggered backward, eyes wide in shock as a crimson bloom spread across his chest. His body hit the floor with a lifeless thud. Stroud's head snapped up, fury flashing across his normally composed face. Elara turned, chest tightening as she saw the figure standing at the entrance. Asher. His gun was still raised, but his hands trembled. His uniform, though still adorned with Imperial markings, looked wrong on him now, like it belonged to a man he no longer was. Stroud straightened slowly. "Asher," he said, voice careful, measured. "Stand down." Asher didn't move. "No." Stroud's gaze darkened. "You know what this means." "I do." A beat of silence passed between them, heavy and final. Then, without another word, Asher fired again. Stroud dodged, the bullet barely grazing his shoulder. But it gave Elara enough time to move. She pushed herself up despite the pain, reaching for the detonator strapped to her belt. The EMP charge. Their only way out. Stroud saw the movement. He lunged, but Asher was faster. The two men collided violently. Stroud's knife drove deep into Asher's stomach, but Asher didn't stop. He grabbed Stroud by the collar, forcing him down as the blade twisted deeper into his own flesh. He turned his head slightly, his breath ragged. "Elara!" His voice was barely above a whisper. "Don't let them control you anymore." His grip tightened, keeping Stroud pinned. "Live!" Elara didn't hesitate. She pressed the detonator. A blinding pulse of blue energy burst outward, consuming the base in a violent wave of static. The lights flickered, then died. Consoles sparked and overloaded, ships in the docking bay shutting down as the electromagnetic surge scrambled their systems. And in the chaos, Elara ran. She stumbled into Nathan, barely managing to drag him to his feet. He groaned but followed, his arms slung over her shoulder as they pushed through the collapsing structure. Behind them, Stroud finally broke free of Asher's grip. His gaze met Elara's through the chaos, rage burning in his expression. But he was too late. By the time he reached them, they were already gone. The stolen Imperial ship was waiting exactly where they had left it, untouched by the blast. Elara shoved Nathan into the co-pilot's seat and threw herself into the pilot's chair. Her hands were slick with blood, hers, Asher's, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The engines roared to life. Through the viewport, the burning remains of the base stretched below, smoke curling into the frozen sky. She exhaled sharply, gripping the controls. No more running. Not anymore. The hum of the stolen Imperial ship was steady, a low vibration beneath Elara's fingertips as she guided them into the void of space. The stars stretched endlessly before them, distant and cold. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't looking for an escape route. She was looking for a fight. Nathan sat beside her, adjusting the navigation system with one hand while pressing the other against his bruised ribs. The battle had left its mark on both of them, burns, cuts, exhaustion settling deep in their bones. But they were alive. For now, that was enough. The comms panel flickered. Elara's gaze sharpened as a new blip appeared on the radar. Small at first, then growing, tracking them. Nathan noticed it too. "That's not one of ours," he muttered. Elara's jaw tightened. It wasn't an Imperial frequency, but that didn't mean they weren't hostile. Whoever they weren't hiding. She tapped a sequence on the console, zooming in on the approaching vessel. A sleek, angular silhouette took shape against the blackness of space. Not Imperial. Not a civilian transport. Something else. "They've been following us since we left the sector," Nathan said, watching as the ship held its distance, not closing in, but not drifting away either. "You think they're waiting for us to make the first move?" Elara didn't answer right away. Her fingers hovered over the thruster controls, her mind already running through potential scenarios. This wasn't a coincidence. Nothing ever was. "Could be a bounty hunter," she murmured. "Could be worse." Nathan huffed out a dry laugh, leaning back slightly. "Define worse." Elara's grip on the controls tightened. "I'd rather not." Silence settled between them for a moment. Heavy, but not uncomfortable. This was the reality they had chosen. Running wasn't an option anymore. The Empire wasn't going to stop hunting them, and neither would the ones who wanted what Elara knew. The past had caught up to her. Again. Only this time, she wasn't alone. Nathan's voice cut through the stillness. "We could make a break for it." Elara turned to him. His blue eyes met hers, steady, unreadable at first. But there was something beneath the surface, something unwavering. He wasn't suggesting it because he was afraid. He just wanted to know where she stood. She studied him for a moment before shaking her head. "No," she said quietly. "No more running." Nathan didn't blink. Didn't hesitate. Instead, he reached across the space between them and took her hand in his. His fingers were rough, calloused from years of war, but warm. Solid. A reminder that she wasn't fighting alone anymore. "This time," he said, his voice steady, "we fight together." Elara exhaled slowly, her pulse steady despite the weight of the moment. She looked back at the radar. The ship was still there, waiting, watching. Whatever was coming next, they would face it. Together. The screen flickered. The stars stretched. And the story continued. No more running. No more hiding. This time, they would fight. Together. Nathan and Elara had survived the impossible, but their journey was far from over. A nameless ship still lurked in the shadows of deep space, watching, waiting. Their enemies wouldn't stop. The past wouldn't stay buried. and their greatest battle was yet to come. What happens next? That's a story for another time. If you loved this journey, make sure to subscribe to Alien Love Chronicles for more breathtaking tales of love and survival beyond the stars. Your support helps bring these stories to life. Let me know in the comments. What do you think is waiting for them on the other side of the galaxy?